So what I was going to do is go over the Wittgenstein slides briefly, and then I've expanded them in ways that I think pull ideas together. Is that okay? So you tell me how quickly you want to go, or how far I should slow down. This is just reminding you about Wittgenstein and the inheritance of ideas, with the right-hand column really forming what we know as continental philosophy, and the left-hand side located more in British analytical philosophy. And the coincidence of Wittgenstein and Heidegger figures so important for what we're talking about. So Wittgenstein's early work is the Tractatus, that's how it's generally referred to, and in that he develops the picture theory of meaning, which is the idea that words refer to things and name objects and so on, and that combinations of words form propositions. The cup is on the table, the bottle is on the table. They state what is the case, which may or may not be true. So language is understood primarily in terms of propositions stating things about the world whose validity is to do with the questions of truth. The idea he moves towards is a complete departure from that, and it moves away from the idea that words are to be understood primarily in terms of correlating with things, table, and rather we don't use words except in contexts of use. Put the cup on the table, or move the table, and so on. So to understand a word is to be able to use it correctly or appropriately. It is to know how to go on in ways others will recognize. Is that all right so far? Understand? Yes? Okay. So I pointed out that the start of the investigations is significant as well. Wittgenstein does not begin in his own voice. He begins with words of Augustine. Much of his work is a criticism of his own earlier work. He begins with St. Augustine's account of learning a language, which begins, "When they, my elders, the adult people around me, named some objects and accordingly moved towards something, I saw this and grasped that the thing was called by the sound which they uttered when they meant to point to the thing, table. They pointed, they said the word." Okay? So it's a very understandable idea of what language and learning a language is. And we could easily do that with another language, with a foreign language. We could do that right now, chair, table, and so on. So the adults in a community, the community itself, they point to objects and name them. And this is a process of ostensive definition. Ostendere is to point in Latin. Showing by pointing. Ostensive teaching, I should say. So what's wrong with that picture? Okay, what's wrong? First, it makes it seem as though all words are names of objects. But what about words such as because, and, sometimes, and very, which you can't point to. You can't point to very, can you? Or point to sometimes. As well as numbers, because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're 4, but also you're 4 as well. Okay, you're familiar with that, but it's a complex thing we have to learn. And also colour words, so yellow, but you don't know whether I'm pointing to the book, or to paper, or to a colour, and you don't know yellow unless you know pink, grey, and so on. And it presumes that the practice of pointing is already understood. So this is very familiar to us, chair, and I point. But if you do this to even a domestic animal like a dog, they typically don't understand. They look at your hand, they don't look at the direction that you're pointing to. So this is a practice that the child comes into through very complex patterns of behaviour. Whereas all that was taken for granted in Augustine's picture. So this general practice is not really a problem with second language learning. Chaises, table, and so on. I can do this in French and you understand. But Wittgenstein's concerned with something more basic, how we come into our lives as human beings, in which, of course, he understands language to be central. So Wittgenstein is certainly a major figure in the so-called linguistic turn of 20th century philosophy. And that linguistic turn realizes that to understand our thought, to understand our being, the nature of the world, and so on, we must always be dealing in language, and our thought is, for the most part, linguistic. Therefore, we must understand language itself. So let's imagine an example of how a primitive language might function. So this is what Wittgenstein does in the second section, second paragraph of the Investigations, where he tries to imagine this tribe, primitive group of people who only have 4 words. And they're words that refer to shapes of building blocks. Block, slab, pillar, beam. And one builder says to the other, block, and so we imagine the second builder bringing the block. Remember? Okay, they don't have other words. This is the extent of their vocabulary, and they are just building. So what's the point of the example? And a large literature has been written on Wittgenstein's builders. Now, initially, what the builders are doing is plausible, is imaginable. We just did imagine it. But these are the only words, the only concepts that the builders use. So can we make sense of what they're doing? For example, block. Does this mean bring me the block, or the block should go there, or the block is on my foot, or what? None of these thoughts seems available to the builders because they only have that word. And once we realize that, it no longer is the word block that you and I have. It's kind of hard to place or to understand. And what are the builders doing? Because normally if we talk about building, you're building a house or a temple or something else, but they just seem to be moving these blocks around. We don't know why. So none of these thoughts would be available to them. So this, quotes, building activity is nothing like what we would mean by building. It's not anything like what we would mean by building. There's a word missing. Not anything like. So some philosophers, A.J.F. for example, great English analytical philosopher, he thought you could make sense of the builders in Wittgenstein's example, but he very much holds on to the idea that words do correspond with things, and that is the basis of meaning. But most readers of Wittgenstein have come to the conclusion that it does not really make sense as an example. So whatever's happening in words, in our use of words, it's something more complicated than that has implied. So we talked about words and practices. And practice, of course, is a very loose, open-ended term. It's very hard to define what a practice is, except that it must be something understood holistically. So cleaning a table, for example, or controlling a camera. Right? You would understand controlling a camera in relation to a picture that you're trying to gather of a particular duration for a particular purpose with a particular knowledge of technique and so on. So I've just said to you that the notion of a practice is open-ended and is holistic. Do you understand open-ended? Open-ended? We can't set precise limits to what would count. Do you understand? Can I? Right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so the Greek word holon, which is a noun, leads to the English whole. You know that word. So I don't know where the W comes from, but don't worry about that. Okay, whole, we say whole. And then the more complicated word, holistic, just comes from this. So to understand something holistically is It's not to understand it as atomistically. So you know atom, yes, okay? Little units, add. But this one, it's all together. Okay? Could you just say that in Japanese, Takuo, please?
Holistic.
Yes.
Explain in Japanese.
Yeah.
アトミスティックは原子としてこう境界線がはっきりした一つの塊としてだからどこまでがその言語に対応してどこから対応しないというのがはっきりしているような見方だというふうにホリスティックっていうのはそういう全体の捉え方ではなくてオープンやセックスオープンエンディングのセックスをいろんな市場に開かれていっているような相対性
だからホリスティックとこの今説明してくださった後期ビトゲンシュタインの言語観の違いっていうのは後期ビトゲンシュタインの言語観っていうのは言葉が意味を持つのはホリスティックなコンテクストとかホリスティックな生活様式とかホリスティックなプラクティスとか実践の中でのみ個々の単語の意味を持っているそういう意味でホリスティックなんですけどアトミスティックっていうのはむしろその前期ビトゲンシュタインの言葉と物体が一対一対応でも一個一個バラバラで対応するみたいなコンテクストに関係なく単語は対象との一対一対応関係を持つという意味でアトミスティックとホリスティック
So Bertrand Russell and the earlier Wittgenstein thought atomistically. So there's one atom, there's another atom is on. So we have a molecule. Of course, I'm exaggerating, but this is the structure of atomistic thinking. Whereas with holistic thinking, the cup is on the table. Now I know a cup is for putting liquid in, and it's for drinking from, and it stops your hand from getting wet, and we like to drink coffee, and we have coffee at certain times of the day. So all of these things endlessly can come together to make that significant. Is on. Okay.
Can I ask a question in
Yes.
English?
Yes.
In our reading seminar, to read your book, Exceeding Fraud,
Yes.
both first name,
Keisuke.
Keisuke and Ryota. Keisuke, Ryota, and all of us read, except Jeremy, we read your book Exceeding Fraud.
Oh, I'm
and
sorry.
there are sort of intermediate degrees that the session for reading and translation. And in that class, these related words can be like whole, the whole person, whole person, whole.
Yeah.
And then you say the etymology of whole is similar to holistic.
Yes.
And then there is a related term integral.
Yes, that's right.
Integral.
Yes. Okay.
Integral.
Okay.
And
Totalizing.
Total.
Yeah, okay.
Total. Can you distinguish a bit?
So this is contrasting with this. You understand that? This is a contrast, all right? Now, when I wrote the whole person paper, what I was talking about was a tendency in our thinking to try to understand certain things as a whole. So etymologically it's the same word, but it means something slightly different. If I try and understand the child as a whole, there's a danger that I think I can understand the child fully. And that's a dangerous thing. We shouldn't think that, because human beings by their very nature exceed what we can understand. But there's a certain kind of psychological approach, for example, that imagines that if we had more tests, we would be able to diagnose the child's full condition. Of course, I'm exaggerating, but can you see that's a totalizing thinking? It's containing everything. Whereas holistic thinking, when I tried to describe this, the cup is on the table holistically, I had to say it's for coffee, it's for drinking from. What's coffee? We have coffee at certain times of the day. It's a social thing to do. It satisfies your thirst. In other words, it goes on and on in loose connections. So holistically, you understand things in terms of relations, and typically it's open-ended. Atomistically, you understand things building upwards from units of meaning. Not relations, but upwards from units of meaning. These are the building blocks of meaning. You see that? And then the ideas of understanding the whole or totalizing in our understanding is operating at a slightly different level, and I was warning of a danger in that paper, of trying to grasp the child fully.
Did you understand what he just said? In our class, we read the course paper on whole person. He just explained the difference between holistic in a kind of positive sense in connection with whether we understand, and a whole person in a totalizing way. Did you understand that?
Sorry, I understand almost all, but could you give me an example, whole, understanding child as a whole?
Okay, well, I just referred to the approach that you find in some psychology. So some psychology think that the things we study are in principle available to complete understanding. So completeness is the target from my point of view. But the psychologist thinks they can get completeness. If we don't have completeness now, it's because psychology hasn't advanced enough. But the more it advances, the better our tests, diagnoses will be, and the more complete our understanding will be. I think that's a dangerous notion. I think it's a violation. Do you understand that? A violation of what human beings are. Do you understand violation? What is violation, please? Yes? Okay. 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 Of course, most psychologists are much more open-minded than I'm saying, but a psychologist such as B.F. Skinner, do you know Skinner? B.F. Skinner, behaviorism, he did have a kind of comprehensive conception of what the human being was like. About 35 years ago, I was teaching in a college of further education, a community college, and so at a lower level, and I was teaching with someone who was a sociologist, and at that time he had just completed his PhD, which was unusual in that context. Most people did not have PhDs. And he said to me, teaching's easy for me now, because now I have my PhD, I know all sociology. I think that's ridiculous. I think it's ridiculous. I don't think if an academic subject is a real academic subject, you cannot know it all. The more you study, the bigger the subject becomes. So he was thinking in a totalizing way, and that goes with a lack of humility as well. Is it okay? Yes? Right, so words and practices. In a sense, understanding a word or a sentence means understanding language as a whole in this good sense. Because when we hear the word cup, we connect it with table, saucer, drink, coffee, being sociable, needing refreshment, understanding the body, needing to go to the toilet sometimes. It just goes on forever, okay? There's no comprehensive understanding, but it goes off into, in a sense, all your language. And if we talk about a 5-year-old child, in a sense, they understand language as a whole. Of course, there are words they don't know, but their understanding of cup is similarly extensive to yours and mine. So a word is used in the context of a practice. If I know what pencil means, there must be a variety of things I can do, like fetch the pencil, draw with it, write with it, and so on. When I learn what a pencil is, I may, at some stages, say that a pen is a pencil. Okay? And it won't matter because you say to the child, bring me a pencil, and they bring a pen, well, you can still write with it. It's okay, you're pleased they brought that. But later on, their use of the word becomes refined. And in Wittgenstein, he doesn't so much use the word practice as this phrase, kind of technical phrase, language game. And he's understanding practices holistically. Why does he want to speak of language games? It's not because they're fun. It's not because they're trivial. Okay, it's nothing like that. He wants to stress their holistic nature. So in a real game, like football, soccer, scoring a goal makes no sense unless you have the whole picture of the game. Two teams, the limits to the pitch, and so on. Do you get that? Or another example, golf. You have to get the ball in the hole. That's completely boring until you have the whole golf course. Perhaps it's still boring, I don't know. And the variety of games, so you see the extraordinary variety of things we call games, and even little children can use the word game about that variety, but there's no essence there. There's no common feature. So Wittgenstein is trying to oppose the idea that for us to understand things, then they must, and to use words coherently, they must always refer to common features. Features they all have. So I gave the further example, we can be deceived by the surface similarity of expressions. So with the expression, I believe that, you all know what this means. But then if we take two different sentences, in a sense the meaning is similar, but really the way those words are used in those contexts is very, very different. I believe that today is the 12th of December. I'm wrong. It may matter and it may not matter much at all. Today is the 12th of December. I've missed your birthday. Now, they could be like that, but it could be, oh, silly me. I must be getting old. I thought it was another date. But with I believe Jesus is my Saviour, there must be so many things of a different order, serious things, for that sentence to be meaningful. Kensuke, can you explain that in Japanese? Because they look a bit puzzled. Yes. And the fact that we have a surface similarity, because I believe is used in both contexts, but you need to look at the language game in order to see the difference of what's being said there.
Would you like to say that the surface similarity both have the syntax or structure, the structure of sentence include I believe that, but
okay, it's not just a similar structure, the same words, okay? Now,
Yes.
if words match objects, then this must be the same in both cases. Okay, of course I know believe is not like table, but if words match objects, then these two must be the same. But it doesn't work like that, because an expression needs to be understood holistically in terms of the kinds of things that go with this. So I gave you some other sentences. I believe today is the 12th of December. Oh no, silly me, it's the 13th. Or I've forgotten your birthday, or something like that. Those are the kinds of sentences that holistically would relate to this utterance. Whereas if I say, I believe that Jesus is my Saviour, even though that is the same expression, its context makes it very, very different. Because now there must be a context of seriousness, how it affects my life as a whole, and so on. So we are deceived by the surface similarity, thinking this must be exactly the same, but meaning here depends upon the holistic context.
If you use a Japanese example, I don't know if anyone can think of a better one, but I was thinking like 新聞を読むと空気を読む。全然 it's the same verb to read, but it's completely different meaning. You have to the meaning of that is completely different かなと。
I'm wondering because do you mean that two sentences have the essential difference, or I think that I believe that today is 12th December have the different meaning in a different context. For example, today is December 12th December can correspond to fact, but if there is a big bang blackout and we all lose consciousness, and then all of us don't know the day what is, then the first sentence become more similar to the second sentence.
Okay, that's very good, because not here, I think, but in Christian countries, I believe that today is the 25th of December. It's a kind of strange sentence because people know when Christmas Day is. You see? Okay. So your example is very good. Or if we put 9/11 there, then that would have had special significance. You understand? Not so much now, but closer to the time of the Twin Towers, then 9/11 was a date that was imprinted in people's minds. So you're completely right that any of these sentences would depend upon context. So the context and the practice of utterance will be crucial for determining the meaning. It's not to design, I'm not denying there's some correspondence. For example, if I say 12th of December, there must be a dating system, and I must be able to look in my diary to check. So it doesn't deny that, but the correspondence does not support the meaning. It's not the basis of the meaning. The practice is the basis of the meaning. It's what we do with the words. Meaning is use. Remember that, okay?
So if the practice is the basis,
Yes.
the criteria or judgment is contingent upon practice.
Yes, it's contingent on what we do together. And that's what we'll come back to a bit more later on. Is that okay? I mean, it's quite interesting that I've used these sentences and they're grammatical sentences, you understand them, but my usage here is completely artificial because I'm using them as examples, okay? So when I say, I believe that Jesus is my Saviour, I'm talking about the usage of that sentence. I'm not confessing to you that Jesus is my Saviour. So there's something rather interesting about teaching contexts. And if someone says this in a play on the stage, it doesn't mean anything in terms of what they, as people, really believe. Does that make sense? Okay. And J.L. Austin writes about that, Derrida writes about that, Cavell does as well. Okay.
Paul, can I? So your point is the performative effect of the two sentences.
Yes. And a bit louder.
You mean the performative effects of the two sentences is different, and one is confessional, and one is reconfirming. Sorry.
Constating? Constating?
Oh,
Yeah, constant.
yes, okay, okay. Right, well that brings in another distinction. You're completely right that that's relevant. So let's suppose that in ordinary context, speaking sincerely, I say, I believe that Jesus is my Saviour. Embedded in that sentence is this statement, Jesus is my Saviour, which is a proposition which I believe to be true about the way things are. That's constative. But my saying, I believe that Jesus is my Saviour, is performative. It's an expression of faith. It has commissive force. If I say this, it must mean I'm committing myself to Christian beliefs. And the commissive is like a variation of the performative in Austin's distinction.
Do you understand the difference between constitutive and performative?
I think we haven't explained that this time.
In my opinion, constitutive means the factual thing. That today is 12th December. It's constitutive thing. The performative is that Jesus is my Savior. I confess my belief. Confess my belief. That's the difference.
Performative is, I think it is itself performance. In my understanding, and I think constitutive is it's like something to confirm or making sure something. Constitutive, I don't know.
Okay, this is so this is the distinction that was drawn by J.L. Austin, John Austin, writing in the 1950s and very early 60s. And what he says is that most philosophy, in trying to understand the nature of meaning, has been preoccupied by a certain kind of sentence. A sentence like, the cup is on the table, or the fan is making a noise. Okay? Which is either true or false. All the time, philosophers are preoccupied by that. But he says what we do with language is more complicated, because sometimes we don't just state things about the world, the cup is on the table. Instead, we do things. So if I say, I promise to give you 10,000 yen, then if I say those words, that is the promise. I'm not describing the promise, I'm making the promise. So it is performing an act. It's carrying out an act. It's not describing, but it's doing something. So when a child is born, someone says, I name the child, okay? In Christian context, the priest says, I name the child, and so on. And then in a meeting, a formal meeting, the chairperson will say, the meeting is now closed. When she says that, that is the closing of the meeting. The exam has now ended. Put your pens down. Okay? And Pierre Bourdieu says that institutions like universities and marriages and games are performatively constructed. It's in putting sentences together in a particular way that we create something. So that's the distinction you've just referred to. That's right, but it's also a fact that if I say I promise to pay you 10,000 yen, I have said to you, I will pay you 10,000 yen. I may not keep my promise, I may run away, but I've still made the promise. So saying the words is doing the promise, it's making the promise. Okay? So there are facts embedded there, yes.
Excuse me. but I think these two distinction is subtle because I will say today is fine weather. I say today is fine weather. Oh, it means that it is sunny today means, and my feeling is good. So each sentence has double meaning.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point. So yeah, really excellent example. So if I say today the weather is fine, then that seems to be stating a fact about the world. We check, the sun's shining, it's not too cold, yes, the weather's fine. But when people say this, it's often said as a kind of celebration. It's a cheerful thing to say. So we enjoy the weather together. I suspect this is even more true in Japanese. I suspect that when people speak Japanese, when you speak Japanese, what you do in saying a fact about the world is very important.
So if I see you in the morning,
Yes, exactly. That's right.
makes us happy.
But here's another factual statement. Sorry, ugly. You have an ugly face, okay? So, is it true or is it not? We'll look at your face and, ooh, ugly, right? So, either it's true or it's not. But of course, if you say that to someone, it's not just stating a fact about the world, you're trying to hurt them or offend them. And so there's a performative element in that. So your comment is wonderful because Austin made this distinction, and then in the same book, he says exactly what you've said. He said, wait a minute, there are obviously factual elements, constitutive elements in this. I believe that Jesus is my saviour, or Jesus is my saviour is a constitutive statement, so there's a constitutive within that performative. And if you look at the constitutive, this is the interesting one, exactly as you said, that very often when we say things that simply seem to be descriptions of the world, then we're doing something in saying those things. We're doing something by saying it's a lovely day because that lifts people's spirits a little bit. It's a celebration or a happy thing to say. Or you have an ugly face crushes someone. Okay? And probably we ignore the element of this in this. And sometimes we are very insensitive because we don't realize this element. And Austin used the word force. So sentences have performative force or constitutive force. Or as I said, commissive force, as he says. Yes. Okay? If I say, la lucha continua, do you know what that means? Spanish, la lucha continua, la lotta continua in Italian. The struggle carries on. It's a sort of revolutionary statement. And if someone says, la lucha continua, they're not just describing the fact that the struggle is carrying on, they're saying, yes, let's support it. Let's support the revolutionary struggle. Okay? So many statements have this thing. So it's a digression, but it's a helpful one. Thank you.
Like Donald Trump in his political speech, as a kind of propaganda,
Yes.
America is strong.
Yes, that's right. Exactly. Now that is either true or not, looked at in constitutive terms, economically or militarily or whatever, but of course his repetition of it has a performative force. It says, come on, join me, we're together. And in Donald Trump's case, it doesn't matter if it's true or not, as long as it makes people feel we're joined together.
Donald Trump's political rhetoric and discourse is a kind of typical example
Yes.
To show the distinction.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Yes. Sure.
So in Donald Trump's case, whether what he said is true or wrong doesn't matter.
Yes, it's a very serious point about the age we live in, because Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message. You know, so often the way something is said is more important than the substance of what is said. More important in the sense that this is what will have the effect on people. The way an idea is marketed, the way an idea is sold to people, that's what shapes their views and changes the world. It's not just a matter of discovering further truth all the time. Okay? So should we carry on? All right? So language games overlap in numerous ways, but there's no system to them, and they have no essence. There is nothing that is common to them all. Is essence clear? Not really?
Sorry?
Is essence clear?
Where is an essence?
Go back and that. So carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. So they both have the element carbon in. Okay? So that would be like an essence. Right, if you look at different language games, they overlap, or look at real games like football and patience and hockey and so on, they overlap, but there's no common element. Okay. So language games are following a rule, and this is coming closer to the things we're most concerned with. To come into a language is to learn how to go on in the appropriate way. So I say the word pencil with the child many times, and they go and fetch things as I want them and so on. And the same thing applies with learning what a spoon is. What do children eat with in Japan when they're very small? With spoons or what? You don't use chopsticks straight away. You do? No, spoons. Okay. So to learn what a spoon is, you don't even need the word necessarily, but you're shown what to do, your hand is guided towards your mouth and so on, and then you recognize what it is. You carry on with it in the appropriate way, and later on you can name the spoon and so on. And so similarly with sitting on a chair, which is not something we do naturally, it's cultural practice, sitting up straight and so on. And there are right ways to do it and wrong ways to do it and so on. And with philosophy also, you learn your way around a subject. You learn what can be said and what can't be said. Now sometimes the rules are rigid. So if you play chess, there are some things you can do and some things you can't do. Do you all know Western chess? You know, yes, okay. So you can't move the bishop horizontally. The bishop must move diagonally. That's a completely rigid rule. But most rules that we're concerned with, especially rules of language and behavior, are open to development. Let's consider some examples. And we did the numbers, so you've got the obvious progression there. Okay, that's not something you're born to do, it's something you learn from counting games and rhymes and so on. And then you get clever and you add 3 each time, and then you square and so on. Okay? And then I said that possibility, the fact that the pattern opens to variation, is absolutely fundamental to human life and behavior. With animals, we can imagine they learn a rule and they just do the same thing again and again and again, which is one reason why pigeons, birds, have been used in checking in the production of aspirins, paracetamol, drugs. Okay, because if there's one that's the wrong shape, it needs to be taken out. Pigeon can recognize that and very reliably take the one that's wrong. If you do it, you'd get bored after 30 seconds and you wouldn't be able to do it. But the animal just carries on, completely reliably. So our boredom is actually very interesting. If we do the same thing, we become bored, so we do something different. And that's a very good thing. That's part of our creativity. And so I gave you these very sophisticated examples now of John Coltrane, and we have the simple tune, and then endless variations on the simple tune, but still with some connection with the original rhythmic pattern and harmonic structure. And the same thing applies to the painting, so the diagonals there have a certain rhythm to them, and that's what Kandinsky was talking about. That's how a painting has its effects. Is that clear? You all right? So between the child, or the 2468, and this, there's the whole range of language where we're following rules, but also developing new sentences all the time. And I'm implying that animals don't do this. They don't develop new patterns. They carry on with the same patterns. So the projecting of a word, we took the word pumpkin, and I gave you these examples. The child's learning the word, and of course it makes some odd associations. But that shows the openness of association that is there. Okay? And then a child, this is an example from Cavell's own daughter, so she learns the word kitty, and initially she uses it, she's introduced to the word when she sees a baby cat. Touch the kitty, someone says. So she strokes the cat. And then of course what she thinks it is referring to is furriness.
Sorry to interrupt you. You already did it before.
I know. Yeah, sorry. All of this is just revision. So you remember, she makes these associations. So then we got on to conformity, resistance, inclusion, exclusion, which comes closer to the thing we're concerned with. And we got to this phrase from Wittgenstein, paragraph 217, and it's the second part that's most significant here. If I've exhausted justifications, well, when do you give justifications? When someone says to you, why are you saying that? Or why did you do that? And you keep saying what you see to be your reasons, and they still say, but why? I don't understand you. Why did you do it? And eventually you say, there's nothing more I can say. This is the way I think. This is what makes sense to me. I can't see anything beyond this. So the conversation seems to have run to a stop. And there are two words I'm going to, one word in particular I'm going to pick up on, bedrock. So you know what rock is? A bedrock is the most secure rock. The one you've cleared away the earth and you're on a firm foundation. So there's the idea of a rock and a foundation that's there. But there's also this unpleasant feeling of the spade twisting in your hand, which suggests frustration. What else can I say? This is what I do. Right. You got that? Do you understand?
Yeah. The day before yesterday, we do it. So
Okay.
that's okay.
Yeah, okay. Right. This is new now then. So bedrock. There may be a cultural element in this, but with the different geology in Europe, then you find a rock and then you can build on that, and it's the most secure, stable building you can have. So here is a castle, big castle, very heavy on a rock. In Japan, it's often better to build on softer ground using bamboo, because bamboo is flexible and supports very good loads, and is the best construction when there is an earthquake, right? Whereas if you build something that's rigid, and then it's going to be more dangerous unless it's particularly strong. So what I'm interested in is the idea here of a foundation that's supported by this. The foundations for the building, and again, a Western idea, the foundations for the church. So St. Peter, his name Petros is rock. It means rock. And Jesus says to him, you are Peter, and on you I will build my church. Okay, he is the rock upon which he's a very strong character. So there's a sort of cultural element in the symbolism of these words, I think. So some people would read the passage we've just looked at. Can I just put it up again? There it is. I have reached bedrock. And they will say, well, that's a good thing. Now things are secure. Now I can build up from there. Others would read this passage and they'd put the emphasis on the twisting of the spade. So now the practice I was relying on of talking and giving an argument and sharing thoughts together has been blocked. So they would read that in a negative way. You'll see how that's relevant in a minute. So there we've got one pattern there. In another text, Wittgenstein talks about a river and the riverbed. Now think a little bit about what a riverbed is like. That is the Camo River. And it's always moving, isn't it? So the main course is there, but every day, even as we speak, the sand at the bottom of the river is moving with the current. But it moves a little bit this way, and then that slides down, and then the water comes and pushes it back that way, and so on. So it changes, but the water keeps shaping it in a certain way. And so you've got a diagram above indicating that. So Wittgenstein also wants to hold on to the idea that our lives and our thought and our beliefs involve sand and river, so that thoughts flow, and there are some things there that seem more or less fixed, but then they can change and form in another way, and then it changes again. So it's a more fluid notion of our lives, our world, our beliefs, perhaps with a firmer structure underneath. I want to add another idea here. Wittgenstein, as far as I know, does not say this, and I suspect that apart from Jeremy, you don't know this word. That's a dredger. I'm sure they must be used in some rivers, in towns probably, or big rivers, and the dredger has lots of cranes and digging equipment because it lifts the riverbed and moves it to help the flow of the water, to stop the riverbed building up too much. Have you seen ships like that? The ship stays more or less still in the river, or only moves slightly, and moves the riverbed about to make it possible for big ships to go through the river. So it's a kind of complication of this idea of the human being interacting with natural forces and making the river navigable, making the river so that we can live with it. So do you have a word for dredger? To dredge? You've got the concept now, as I've told you. No?
I don't know what they
Do you understand the idea?
Yeah.
Have you seen anything like that?
Yes, especially in Western country.
Oh, I see. Okay, yes. Again, it may be to do with geology and weather and so on.
What's the translation? So this is language game, because we hardly ever see it.
Yes.
We cannot associate the translation with the option.
Yeah. I can never believe that this process works, because the river is so big, and the amount of sand they pull up is so small, it looks hopeless to me. But this is what's done, and it's very important in some countries. In the Netherlands, for example, where there are many water flows, it's essential this happens.
Grid is made of sand, you say?
The riverbed typically will be something like sand.
Yeah, dredges.
The dredger picks up the sand and moves it. Okay, so it might take a lot of sand from here, put it in the boat, and then take it somewhere else, and then dump the sand.
有田海みたいにあるんですよね。考えとはまた違います。
Yeah, in order that the big ship
Yes.
can go.
Exactly, yes. So here, this is building up. If it builds up too much, then perhaps the river will be too narrow. Or if this part builds up too much, there'll be no flow of water that's deep enough. So it's a matter of managing this interaction between water and land. So Wittgenstein doesn't say it, but I just think it's an interesting idea in relation to his use of riverbeds. Can I carry on? So going back to rules, because this seems to be the thing we've been concerned with, what kinds of rules are there? At one level, there are rules that are to do with etiquette or good manners. So maybe it would amuse Jeremy a bit. When I was a child, it was a sin, it was a very bad thing, to hold your fork in your right hand. And when we met Americans sometimes, they used to do this.
No, but Japanese people eat only with fork in right hand.
Yes, okay. And I think that's an American thing. So often in America, it would be perfectly normal to hold the fork in the right hand, cut up the food, and then just use your fork.
And in Japan, you are not supposed to put your left hand when you are using chopsticks in the right hand.
Well, I didn't know that.
You're supposed to hold two hands on the table.
Yes, okay. Can you hold chopsticks in your left hand? Can you hold chopsticks in your left hand? Is that allowed?
If someone is left-handed.
It's this then, is it? Okay. So these things seem arbitrary, don't they? You know, they're just practices that develop in a country. That doesn't mean they're pointless or meaningless. And I think there are many of these practices that we should go on along with. We should do what is the customary thing. Okay? Because we have to do these things somehow. Human beings establish a pattern for doing it, culturally different in different places at different times, but it's appropriate to go along with it. The authority is nothing more than the practice itself, the convention between people. Okay? And then a step up from there, a step a little bit more serious. In Japan, you should take off your shoes when you go inside the house. I'm sure that's not true in every single house in Japan, because there would be Western style houses or Western people or people who don't care about these things, perhaps.
But I think it's true in every single house.
You do? Right, okay.
You don't come to the house with dirty shoes.
Okay. But what I think is interesting here is that rather more seems to be at stake. Whether you hold the fork in this hand or that hand, or whether you have your hand here and chopsticks there or whatever, that seems very, very arbitrary. But in the case of don't bring your shoes inside the room, then that alters the character of the room. It alters the relationship between being inside and outside. It possibly generates a certain notion of being at home, which is characteristically Japanese, a certain at-homeness. So a much more complicated structure of relationships and reality in our world is generated there. It's a particular realization, making real, of what being at home is.
So could you say that?
Yes. So, okay. So to use the English-American example, if you hold your fork in your left hand or your right hand, seems completely arbitrary, really. Okay, it's just a matter of convention, even though when I was a kid it was treated as something very important. So you just go along with the local convention, there's nothing more to it. But in the case of take your shoes off before you come in the house in Japan, then again it's a matter of convention, but rather more depends on it. More arises from that, because that practice alters what being in a home means. It alters what being comfortable means. It's a different realization of home and of comfort. And those are quite deep things in human experience. If you did that in Africa, it probably wouldn't have the same significance because the whole social context would be different. But the social context is a part of our real world. That's the point I'm trying to drive home. In the fork example, it seems very slight, very trivial. With the shoes example, as you know from your own experience, it feels much more important. It's part of what creates being at home and being inside for a Japanese. Yes?
And I know that you're going to talk about this later, but if authority, as you said, is convention itself, the next question for that statement is, so who is the authority?
Yes.
Who decides?
Well, you're right.
And who takes control over the context, social context?
Yes. I don't think there's any underlying rationale for this. There could be. This would be relevant to some of the dietary rules we have. So, if you're Jewish or Muslim, you don't eat pork. Now, there could be some very good medical health reason behind that, that at the time the Old Testament describes, 5,000 years ago or so, at that time many pigs were unhealthy to eat, and so your chances of being ill would be much greater. So it looks like there's a good health reason which has been turned into a rigid religious rule. Okay? That's probably not true now because of the way animals are produced. There's no health risk, but the religious rule carries on as a means of defining a people. Okay? Dietary rules are very, very complex and subtle and a little bit neurotic sometimes as well. So I guess we don't eat rats. Now probably laboratory produced or farmed rats would be perfectly healthy to eat, but I guess we'd all be repulsed by the idea. So it can be very neurotic, very, very complicated, but still very important to us in understanding ourselves and what it is to live well and so on. So there are many different cases here. Sometimes there's a good kind of foundational practical rule. At other times, it's not that there's a good foundational rule, but something's generated out of the practice, out of the convention. And that, I think, is the case with taking your shoes off when you go in the house.
Yes. And I think that it brings us back to the title of your PowerPoint, which is Conformity, Resistance, Inclusion, and Exclusion. Because the very fact that there is this kind of bedrock convention as the basis of social practice in itself immediately creates who is going to be included, who is going to be excluded.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely. So I'm going to give you 4 categories here of where rules are significant. The second one is in games. So you cannot play chess unless you totally agree to the rules, totally go along with the rules. There is no question of whether you are going to agree, because if you say, I'm going to move my bishop horizontally and vertically, then you're not playing chess. Okay? So it's not a question of whether you agree. You have to agree if you're playing chess. You have to do that. And then there are questions of argument, reasoning, or justification. Justification was the word that came up in Wittgenstein's text. So I ask you why you're doing a PhD, Kensuke. Why are you doing a PhD in philosophy of education? Dozo? So his spade's turned already.
Yeah.
But someone, you needn't, okay. Someone says, why are you doing something? You begin to offer reasons, and they say, why? I don't understand. So you carry on offering reasons. Now, obviously, there are limits as to what can count as a reason. If Kensuke has said, I'm doing philosophy because philosophy begins with the letter P, then I wouldn't accept that as a reason. Would you? It's kind of irrelevant to why you study a subject. Whereas if you say, I'm interested in ideas, then we have a first step in what would count as a reason. So we all agree that because it begins in P is irrelevant. We all agree that because it's to do with ideas is relevant. Okay? So it's a matter of agreement between us as to what makes sense. Up to a point, at least. And the final case is this, and this is what it's all come down to, really, that we agree in the language we use, because if I say, look at the pencil, then I'm actually saying something that's a bit odd for a grown-up speaker of English, because it's not a pencil, but it's like a pencil. If a 3-year-old says, look, pencil, pencil, then you kind of accept what they are meaning, and so on. So in order to use the word pencil in a way that I can communicate with you, I basically have to refer to pencils with lead in, not to this kind of thing, and not to this. Okay? So there's a consistency in use in all the words we use, which is a very foundational, very necessary to our being speakers, communicators, and thinkers as well. Language involves the following of rules. There's a rule for the correct use, or there are rules for the correct use of pencil, which doesn't mean we have a list of them, but we know what someone must say if they say pencil appropriately. So the questions that are troubling us here then are, what secures the rule? What's its basis, if you like? Where does the authority to decide come from, which is the question Naoko just phrased? How far is the rule open to development? Can the rule be changed? So if you take the example of the movement of the bishop in chess, then that cannot be changed without producing a different game. Okay? Even a slight change in the rules in chess would make the whole game different. But in the case of pencil, there's much more scope, because maybe you have an electronic pencil that writes on your phone or your computer, and I think we could use the word pencil there, or at least computer producers could start to use the word pencil. It can be changed in our use. At one time, the word pen was used for a pen with flowing ink in it, a fountain pen, an old pen, and then it came to be used for a ballpoint pen, a biro, or what do you call, or a felt pen or something. It became more widely used. Okay, and can the rules be changed? Well, of course, it's quite possible that the convention of taking your shoes off when you go in the house could change over time in Japan. If there were too many Westerners around, maybe. Or if young people just decided we've had enough of this. If styles in footwear changed, who knows, it could change. But something like the chess rule can't change in that way. Plainly, the rule over the fork has changed in my lifetime, so it's completely normal to hold your fork in the right hand and so on now, in the UK, I mean. So, to some extent here, we seem to be looking for basic facts, rocks on which we can build. And maybe in the question of diet, if you say pigs are poisonous, so don't eat pork, we seem to have a basic fact that's uncontroversial, if that were true. But often, as for example in the shoe culture in Japan, there is no basic fact there, but out of that a shared practice, a certain substance to our social world has been developed. Mostly Wittgenstein is to be seen as an anti-foundationalist writer, and indeed most of the other philosophers we are, or Nauka and I are interested in, are anti-foundationalist. But I hope you can see how this comes into play in the present discussion. So, where does the authority come from? In some cases, it's community agreement. So, chess is not based out there in the world. It's a game that human beings invented, and someone said, let's make it like this, that you must move your bishop diagonally, and that turned out to produce a very good game with all the other rules. So that agreement made those rules fixed. Shogi, is that the right word? So shogi is obviously related, I guess it's older, but that has rules that seem to look the same in some ways, or it's a similar game in some respects, but also very different. So it's like the relation between rugby and soccer, I guess. So sometimes the rules will be through community agreement, through convention, the shoe example. Maybe they are imposed by government. Drive on the left-hand side of the road if you're in Japan or in England, but not most places. Okay? They may be prescribed by a holy book. Some rules drawn from the Bible or the Quran would be like that. Never do this. And a final possibility, maybe the rules are developed much more informally, and I'm going to say they're developed in conversation, very loosely. So, if you take the word revolution, maybe I gave you this example. So revolution originally is a term in physics for this movement, right? And then in 1789, there's trouble in France, and people refer to it as the French Revolution, a huge political change, turnaround. Sometimes we talk about the American Revolution before that as well. And then the French Revolution stays in people's memories. In 1916, we have the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, 1949, Che Guevara in South America, Che Guevara sweatshirts, Che Guevara. Okay, so it becomes a kind of style, a sort of fashion. There's a coffee chain called Coffee Revolution. So it could be a high street shop and so on. The Beatles have a song, We're Calling for a Revolution. So that word that started in physics, just through ordinary usage, starts to have new connotations and connections. Okay, so it shifts. That process is going on all the time when we speak, because we're using words in original ways. We're reshaping what can be said. We're also altering the connotations of a particular expression. Sometimes deliberately stretching a possibility of meaning, sometimes responding to events. So 9/11 meant something different in 2002 from what it meant in 2000. The event occurred in 2001. Do you see that? Things are moved on. So most of our lives is spent in these ongoing fluid practices in which meaning is moved on. Is this all right? You look very bored and tired. Am I talking too much? Yeah.
No, I think you go too fast. Can I ask a question between the difference between community agreement and conversation? Because I think community agreement is more sort of constraining, can exercise more constraining force, whereas conversation allows us more space to be engaged in dialogue with what is right, what is wrong.
But I don't mean that we're just in dialogue about what is right and what is wrong. I don't think anybody ever sat down and said, what should we mean by revolution? Let's alter the meaning. It used to mean this. Let's now refer to political events. It doesn't happen like that. It's by a much more fluid, non-specific or non-theorized process of change, that words change in their context. That's what's normally going on. But the game of chess didn't exist forever. You know, there was some earlier form of the game, and then gradually it settled down into the game we know, which as far as I know has been the same for hundreds of years. But that's not true with soccer. So, for example, in soccer, 40 years ago, when the goalkeeper had the ball, they were not allowed to just walk around with it. If they walked, they had to bounce it on the ground every 3 steps or something. They weren't just to walk around with it. I can give you other examples from similar sports. So the Football Federation discussed a problem in the game and said, let's change this. So you get little changes made by an official body that alters the game. Right? So chess is a very static game in relation to some other sports. Do any of you watch rugby? No, no, okay. Well, there was something in rugby that was regarded as a foul, where when the players jumped up, their friends pushed them up like this. That was a foul. And then someone said, why don't we make this legal? Why don't we allow it? So the rule was changed, and now it's a spectacular feature of the game. That someone throws a ball in, people jump up for it, and their friends almost throw them into the air, so they get very high to catch the ball. It's improved the game. Okay. So sometimes by convention, and it's completely natural, or it's not articulated, sometimes by discussion and so on.